Ananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Gaura Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the lotus feet of Sri Sri Guru, Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om
Om
Namo
Namo
Bhagavate
Vasudevaya.
Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om
Om
Namo
Namo
Bhagavate
Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Hare Krishna. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We continue our study of Srimad Bhagavatam. We're on the first canto, 15th chapter, and today's text is number 15. Yo Bhishma Karna Guru Shalya Chamus Vabhadra Rajanya Varya Ratamandala Manditasu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Rata Yuttapanam Ayor Manangsi Chadrisha Saha Oja Archat Yo Bhishma Karna Guru Shalya Chumush Vabhadra Rajanya Varya Rata Mandala Manditashu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Rata Yuttapanam Ayor Manangsi Chadrisha Saha Oja Archat Yo Bhishma Karna Guru Shalya Chumush Vabhadra Rajanya Varya Ratamandala Mandidasu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Rata Yuttapanam Ayor Manangshi Chadrisha Saha Oja Archat. Please chant.
Hare Krishna. Yo Bhishma Karna Guru Salya Chamushva Abhadra Rajanya Varya Rathamandala Manditasu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Ratha Yutthapanam Ayurmanam Si Chadrash Saha Oja Archat.
Yo Bhishma Karma Guru Shalya Chamush Adabra Rajanya Varya Ratamandala Manditashu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Rata Yuttapanam Ayurmanam Sicha Drisha Saha Aja Archat. Hare Krishna.
Yo Bhishma Karna Guru Shalya Chamushpadabra Rajanya Varya Rathamandala Manditasu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Ratha Yuttapanam Ayurmanam Sichadrisha Saha Oja Archat.
Yo Bhishma Karna Guru Shalya Chamushvadhabra Rajanya Varya Rathamandala Manditasu Agrecharo Mama Vibho Rata Yuttapana Ayurmanam Sichadrusha Saha Oja Archat.
Anyone else? Okay. Yaha, it is he only, Bhishma, Bhishma, Karna, Karna, Guru, Dronacharya, Shalya, Shalya, Chamushu, in the midst of the military phalanx, Adabra, immense, Rajanyavarya, great royal princes, Ratamandala, chain of chariots, Manditasu, being decorated with, Agecharaha, going forward, Mama, of mine, Vibho, O great king, Rata Yuta Panam, all the charioteers, Ayuhu, duration of life or fruitive activities, Manangshi, mental upsurges, Cha, also, Drisha, by glance, Sahaha, power, Ojaha, strength, Archat, withdrew. Translation by Srila Prabhupada. It was he only who withdrew the duration of life from everyone, and who, in the battlefield, withdrew the speculative power and and strength of enthusiasm from the great military phalanx made by the Kauravas, headed by Bhishma, Karna, Drona, Shalya, etc. Their arrangement was expert and more than adequate, but he, Lord Sri Krishna, while going forward, did all this. Purport. The absolute personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, expands himself by his plenary Paramatma portion in everyone's heart, and thus he directs everyone in the matter of recollection, forgetfulness, knowledge, the absence of intelligence, and all psychological activities. Bhagavad Gita 15:15. As the Supreme Lord, he can increase or decrease the duration of life of a living being. Thus, the Lord conducted the battle of Kurukshetra according to his own plan. He wanted that battle to establish Yudhishthir as the emperor of the planet, and to facilitate this transcendental business, he killed all who were on the opposite party by his omnipotent will. The other party was equipped with all military strength, supported by big generals like Bhishma, Drona, and Shalya. And it would have been physically impossible for Arjuna to win the battle had the Lord not helped him by every kind of tactic. Such tactics are generally followed by every statesman, even in modern warfare, but they are all done materially by powerful espionages, military tactics, and diplomatic maneuvers. But because Arjuna was the Lord's affectionate devotee, the Lord did all this himself without personal anxiety by Arjuna. That is the way of the devotional service to the Lord. The translation one more time. It was he only who withdrew the duration of life from everyone, and who, in the battlefield, withdrew the speculative power and strength of enthusiasm from the great military phalanx made by the Kauravas, headed by Bhishma, Karna, Drona, Shalya, etc. Their arrangement was expert and more than adequate, but he, Lord Sri Krishna, while going forward, did all this. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminita Namane Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Vacharni Nirvishesha Shunya Varipaschatya Deshatarne Om Ajnanati Mirandasya Jnanagjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Okay. So today we're going to talk about faith. For some people these days, the word faith, or even the idea of faith, seems naive, right? Many people consider that those who profess to have faith in something are actually gullible. They see it as a weakness or a crutch, right? There's even been a long-running debate, or a feud even, between self-proclaimed scientists and religionists. This clash of ideas has led to a growing number of people leaving behind religious faiths and instead relying on perceived knowledge, right? We see this all the time where people, they almost feel ashamed to profess their faith because you have this whole other, it's basically a religion, but it's called science. They call it science. It's not very scientific. We'll get more into that. And basically, this type of person, this self-proclaimed scientists, they claim that you shouldn't believe in or even encourage other people to accept that which is not directly perceived, right? So they claim to only believe what they have directly perceived, or which they have considered to be proven, at least to their version of proof anyway. And we'll get to a little bit more of that later, right? So these so-called scientists consider religionists to be sentimental fanatics who believe in fairy tales and are not at all intelligent, right? And we see this a lot. Actually, in many cases, they have a point when they say this. After all, Srila Prabhupada did say that religion without philosophy is sentiment, right? We've all heard that. So if one's faith is not reinforced by an authorized philosophy, then it's just sentiment, right? It's incomplete and it's sentimental. So as it turns out, faith isn't enough, right? There are different kinds of faith. But before we talk about the different kinds of faith, because they're listed in the Shastra, but before we talk about those, I feel the need to point out that actually everyone has faith, right? It's not something that's unique to the so-called religionists, right? The self-proclaimed scientists, they have faith. The religionists have faith. The atheists, the gross materialists, the impersonalists, everybody has faith. So first we're going to talk about that, because otherwise it's just a debate over whether we should, rely on faith or rely on our perception, right? So everyone has faith. So whether it's faith that things will continue to happen the way they have in the past, or faith that we will continue to breathe when we fall asleep, or faith that our predecessors didn't make any mistakes when they came up with their so-called proofs, we all have some sort of faith. Faith is there, right? Ironically, the self-proclaimed scientists who openly abhor faith, they have a great deal of it. They have to have a great deal of it in order to believe what they do. Much of modern so-called science is built upon a shaky foundation of unproven theories, right? You have Big Bang theory, you have theory of evolution, you have the theory of life coming from matter. These are all things that aren't proven, they can't be proven, but these so-called scientists use these specific theories to build up more what they call proofs, right? So based on this, we now know that this and this and this and this, right? So they're trying to build something that looks very secure on top of a very shaky foundation. So it's not very sustainable. It's not steady. So, and so they have faith that these theories, which are unproven, are not only correct, but they're actually beyond contestation. In other words, no one is allowed to argue about them. They have to be accepted. Even though they're taught as theory in the schools, they act as if you have to believe them and you can't question them. So if that's not faith, I don't know exactly what you would call faith, right? So but the faith they have is actually quite strong, right? It's absurd that they have faith in these things, but it's quite strong. Not only is it strong faith, but it's not backed up by philosophy. And hopefully that sounded familiar because we just talked about that. Faith or religion without philosophy is sentimentalism, right? We just said that. So these so-called scientists are also completely sentimental because they have faith in something that they're not allowed to question and they can't actually prove, right? So this puts these so-called scientists and the neophyte religionists in a very similar category. It's not exactly the same category, right? Because at least one has faith in something that's real and the other has faith in fantasy, but it's at least a similar category. It means they have faith in something, but they don't have a philosophy to back it up. So it is sentimentalism, right? So regarding the statement that I made earlier about the accepted versions of proof that these so-called scientists, believe. So we actually touched on it a little by mentioning those different theories that they accept as fact and then build these further so-called proofs upon them. Let's see. Sorry, I'm fumbling through some notes here. So doing this, putting one's faith exclusively in what we can perceive, right, or experience by either logic or direct perception is actually a very special kind of foolishness, right? Because anyone who's ever been to a magic show or who's had a bad dream or who has gone on the rides in Orlando, Florida, for example, understand that our senses are imperfect, right? And as such, we can perceive things that aren't actually real, right? We have experience of this, all of this. We see something and we think it's one thing, and then later we realize, oh no, that wasn't actually what I thought it was. It was, the senses are imperfect, right? So therefore, if we base our faith on what we experience, right? And we have experience that our senses are imperfect, this is what's called a self-defeating philosophy, right? So I only believe what I see on experience. I've experienced that I have imperfect senses. Therefore, I can't believe anything I've ever experienced, right? That's logical. It's a self-defeating philosophy. So based on that evidence, imperfect senses, we'd have to conclude that we cannot trust anything that we perceive, right? So like I said, it's a very special kind of foolishness, thinking that we should only accept things that we can perceive. Now, from the Shastras, we understand that our senses are imperfect, right? This is easily verifiable. A good example is many years ago, I don't remember how long ago it was, but it was a long time ago, there was a photograph that was circulating online, and it was a photograph of a dress. And people were arguing about whether it was, I think it was one group of people said it was like blue and silver, and another group of people said it was black and gold or something. I might be getting the colors mixed up. But there was this big divisive debate that was going on, and people were saying, no, it's clearly, blue and silver. And everybody else was like, no, it's clearly black and gold. Now, I don't know exactly what color the dress was. It could have been purple and pink for all I know. But the point is, some people were absolutely wrong, right? They couldn't all be right. Therefore, imperfect senses, right? Easily verifiable. It comes from Shastra. We heard about it, but it can also be verified by perception. We can see that our senses are not perfect, right? Another one of our imperfections that we learn about in Shastra is that we're prone to committing mistakes, right? We hear this term, to err is human. That's a very common saying. There's actually no one in existence who had never committed a mistake. No one in this material world can say that, oh, I've never committed a mistake. So this is very verifiable too. Very easily we can verify this. Whether it's a minor mathematical error or we accidentally say the wrong word, so many things. Actually, recently I was giving a class and I was speaking about Jagai and Madai, and I accidentally said Jai and Vijay, right? And so the students were kind of looking at me thinking, what? That doesn't make so much sense. And they said, do you mean? So they said Jai and Vijay? And they sort of had this look on their head. And I said, oh, did I say Jai and Vijay? I meant Jagai and Madai, which actually, if you really analyze it, they are Jai and Vijay in their fourth lifetime. They came as Jagai and Madai. But I was talking about Jagai and Madai because I was talking about how they sinned so much that, the people who were keeping track of their sins, they couldn't keep up with it. They were just frequently committing the most abominable sins that, they couldn't even be documented properly by a whole team of people who do that for a living. So accidentally saying, Jai and Vijay instead of Jagai and Madai, that's an example of committing mistakes. So we've all committed mistakes, right? Another defect we have that we learn from Shastra is we are subject to illusion, right? Also easily verifiable. Like I said, anyone that's been to a magic show, we see, for example, this lady goes up on stage and she goes into this box, and then the magician cuts the box in half and then puts, one half of the lady is over here and the other half of the lady's over here, and everybody's, oh man, he just cut that lady in half. And then he puts it back together. She comes out of the box. She's fine. Everyone's okay. So that's illusion. We perceived a lady getting cut in half. The fellow didn't actually cut her in half and put her back together. Otherwise, he wouldn't be working in a nightclub, entertaining half-drunk people. He would be working in a hospital, making a bunch of money. He'd be, helping disabled veterans be able to walk again, etc. It's, in other words, it's an illusion, right? And so, so that's the third one, right? Also very easily verifiable. Now, beyond these three, each of these three, by the way, being enough to just on their own to not rely on our personal experience as a basis for our philosophy in life, is a fourth defect, right? And that is the tendency to cheat others. We learned this from Shastra. So even if our senses are perfect, we didn't commit any mistakes, and we weren't subject to illusion, if we experience something that we just don't like, we will refuse to accept it beyond any logical or reasonable excuse, right? In other words, I understand it perfectly well, I just don't accept it, right? So sometimes we see this happens with us in our mind. The mind, despite all of the good counsel of the intelligence, will refuse to do something, right? So there's two examples we can give there that are easily verifiable. One is when we become sick, right? The intelligence tells the mind, hey, you're sick, you have to take this medicine. But the mind doesn't want to take the medicine because it doesn't taste very well. The senses don't like the taste of it. It tells the mind, no, you don't want that. So sometimes the mind wins. And despite all this logic that, well, even if it tastes bad, if you take it now, you'll feel better very soon. Otherwise, you have to continue suffering, in a different way. Another example, which may be even more relatable, is when our favorite food is available, even after we're full, we still want to eat more of our favorite food, right? And so the intelligence says, hey, you've definitely eaten enough, you don't need to eat anymore. But the tongue, it says it wants more, and the mind says, yeah, why not? And so we tend to, keep eating. And then the intelligence says, hey, remember last time you got sick, and then I tried to talk you into taking medicine, and you didn't listen to me then either, right? So we have plenty of examples of how we have a tendency to cheat. This is a tendency to cheat. Despite all logic and reason, we just don't feel like accepting it. It's not convenient for us, right? We don't feel like it. And so this is called cheating, right? So we have all four of these, and they're all four easily verifiable, these defects, right? And so direct perception is proven to be a highly imperfect and unreliable basis of knowledge and truth, right? So just based on actual science, we can show that you can't rely on logic or direct perception to actually come to a reliable conclusion, right? And so these we all get from, we understand these from Shastra, but you can also perceive these directly. Now, at this point, one might argue that although they can't rely on their own direct perception, admitting that they have these four defects, but the scientific authorities that they do accept are less prone to these defects, right? And are therefore more reliable or more worthy of our trust and faith, right? So that they could make that argument, right? But even the most advanced mathematicians, who generally don't base anything on unproven theories like the so-called scientists do, who can't even explain where life comes from, let alone what's required to sustain it. Actually, before I finish this sentence, because this is an important thing to distinguish between the so-called scientists and then the logicians or the mathematicians, right? So the so-called scientists, for example, when it comes to life on other planets, for example, right? So there are these people, and they actually look to be quite scientific. They use logic and they use reason. You know, they say, okay, well, regarding life on other planets, well, we humans, we need a certain amount of oxygen, we need a certain amount of water, we need a certain, range of temperature. It can't be too hot or too cold. Pardon. And so, there are these very specific restrictions and guidelines that are required to sustain this human life, right? And so they send up these probes and sensors to different planets, and then they say, okay, well, these things that are required to sustain human life aren't there. Therefore, there cannot be life on these other planets, right? This is the conclusion they come to. It sounds very logical. It sounds, quite educated. They're using their sensors, and they know exactly how much of all these things that a human needs. But the problem with their conclusion that there can't be life on other planets is we have evidence right here on our own planet where there are living entities in the ocean, right? Humans can't live underwater in the ocean, right? But there's a whole ecosystem that is underwater. They all live there. They all, all of their food is provided for them all under the water. And so we have evidence that there are living entities that can live and sustain their life quite nicely, actually, in a place where we humans can't. So to think that on all these other planets there can't be life because no human can live there, it's just bonkers, right? It's not science. It looks like science, but it's not science. It's hubris. It's thinking that, well, no, if human can't do it, then no one can do it, right? But we have direct evidence of that happening right before our eyes, but we just don't accept it, right? So let's say you say, okay, well, these so-called scientists, they're clearly not really scientists. But if you go for the logicians, the mathematicians, right? These guys, they don't even, in other words, they won't say something's proven unless they properly establish it. So my math teacher in high school, for example, he said when he was in college, they had to prove that 2 + 2 was 4. And he said, how do you think you would prove that 2 + 2 is 4? And we all said, well, if you have 2 of something and then you get 2 more, then you have 4. That's how you prove it. And he said, no, that's not how you prove it. You have to prove that 2 + 2 isn't 5. It's not 3. It's not 1. Nothing else. In other words, you have to prove that in any circumstance whatsoever, 2 + 2 cannot be anything but 4. And if you can't do that, you can't say 2 + 2 is 4 because it's inconclusive, right? So you would think, okay, these mathematicians, they're very logical. They're not going to be prone to what these so-called scientists do, missing these little, or big steps in logic, right? So you might say, okay, well, then we'll just rely on those mathematicians, right? The proper so-called, scientists. But even these logicians, they actually have to put their faith in irrational and imaginary concepts in order to establish their proofs, right? So I don't want to get into this too much because I can go on this for days. But just for example, in order to figure out the area, circumference, or volume of any sort of circle, sphere, cylinder, etc. In other words, it's a very common thing that has to be done. One has to rely on an irrational number. It's called pi. You can sort of define it. You can say it's between this number and this number, but the number actually, it has a decimal that never ends and it never repeats. It's an irrational number. You can't precisely pinpoint it, but we use it. We have to use it in order to precisely define areas, circumferences, volumes, etc., of anything round or spherical. So that's the first one, which, that one, okay, maybe, it's faith, but it's, at least you can narrow it down between this and this, right? Well, another one is I. It's an imaginary number. It's the square root of -1, which is impossible because no number times itself can be -1. So these mathematicians use this imaginary number so that they can continue their equation. So if they have to take a square root of a negative number, they use I as a placeholder, and then later they accommodate, their whatever was done. And then, in other words, they can come up with the right answer, but only because they rely on an imaginary number. There's also in fractal geometry, there's this concept where you can put an infinite perimeter of a shape within a finite shape. You can actually fit infinity in the palm of your hand, right? And then another one it's called Gabriel's horn. It's where there's a vessel that has an infinite surface area. The surface area is infinite, but it can only hold a finite amount of liquid, right? So these things in math exist. You have to have faith in order to understand them. You have to have not only faith, but also so basically it's faith in that which you can't see, but also you have to accept things that aren't necessarily perceivable through logic or direct perception, right? So basically it's a similar thing to faith, right? So therefore everyone has some sort of faith, right? And since faith without philosophy is sentimentalism, it is in our best interest to add authoritative philosophy into the mix, right? So we aspiring Vaishnavas turn to the authoritative Shastras as the basis of our knowledge and truth. The words of the Supreme Lord are aparusheya. It means they're infallible. They're beyond defects, right? Unlike we humans who have the 4 defects. So when we put our faith in these Shastras, also called Shabda, we're able to slowly but surely verify these truths, both logically through Anuman and through direct perception, Pratyaksha, right? As we advance spiritually, these things which are at first only known theoretically from the Shastra become understood through logic and through direct perception. So logic and sense perception are accepted as proofs only when they are supported by the Shastras. Otherwise, they're not accepted, right? So earlier I mentioned that there are different types of faith. So I think we've covered in detail where we should put our faith, right? But now we'll talk about the types of faith, because this is also important. So as we mentioned, faith without philosophy is sentimental, even if that faith is put in an authorized process. Without the authorized philosophical backing, it is not complete, right? Faith isn't passive. We have to act on faith. So faith has to be both strong and it has to be deep, right? So strong faith means that it's unflinching, even in the midst of adversity. But deep faith means that it's backed by philosophy, and it has to be verified and experienced. So an example of a strong but not deep faith is, say, for example, a friend who you trust told you something, and so you believe them, right? And if somebody tries to tell you differently, then you will say, no, I know this, for a fact. I heard from a reliable source. My friend told me, and you can't change my mind, right? Now, this person can't explain why they believe what they believe. They just know that they believe it based on something that they, some sort of trust that they have, right? So it's a strong faith, means that nobody can convince them otherwise, but it's a shallow faith. It's not deep because they can't explain why they have that faith, or they can't really convince others, right? So the 2 types of faith are described by Srila Jiva Goswami in his Bhakti Sandarbha, and they are Lokika Shraddha and Shastriya Shraddha. Now, at this point, I want to point out that Lokika Shraddha doesn't mean strong, because earlier I said strong and deep, right? So Lokika Shraddha doesn't mean strong faith, but from the example I just gave, Lokika can be very strong, but the definition of Lokika is mechanical, ritualistic, or imaginative. So, or not imaginative, imitative, right? So mechanical means that, we do it, we don't know why. We do it because we believe it, but we don't exactly know why. We can't explain why. Ritualistic means that there was some tradition that we're following, and imitative means someone who we trust did it like that, so we also follow their faith, basically, right? So Lokika Shraddha has its limits. And even in the early stages of faith, it can be based on these mechanical, ritualistic, or imitative things, and it can become strong, right? In other words, people won't be able to convince us otherwise, but we also won't be able to convince anyone else. We won't be able to say why we do it. We just say that we are convinced that we will do it. So it's strong faith, but it's not deep, right? So that being said, even devotees on the Madhyama platform can have what's called Lokika Shraddha, not Shastriya Shraddha. In the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Lord Chaitanya instructed Srila Sanatana Goswami about the three levels of devotees, Kanishta, Madhyama, Uttama. And in Madhya Lila, chapter 22, verse 67, he said, quote, "A person whose conclusive knowledge of the Shastras is not very strong, but who has developed firm faith in chanting the Hare Krishna mantra, and who is also undeterred in his execution of the prescribed devotional service, should be considered a Madhyama Adhikari. Such a person is very fortunate," right? So the faith is there, and it's undeterred, and it's strong, and it's steady, but they don't have conclusive knowledge of the Shastra. So if they won't be able to really convince others. That's the one. Now, commenting on this particular verse from Chaitanya Charitamrita, which was quoted in Nectar of Instruction, verse 5, Srila Prabhupada writes, quote, "A Madhyama Adhikari is a Shraddhavan, a staunchly faithful person. He is actually a candidate for further advancement in devotional service," end quote. So this is basically talking about, you would say, the sandhya between Lokika and Shastriya. So in other words, there's some Shastric understanding, but not enough to actually be able to explain why they follow, and not enough to convince others. So it's basically where Lokika is ending and Shastriya is taking more. In other words, there's overlap. It's not that you go from one to the other, but it's where the Shastriya is starting to become more prominent, right? And so when that then becomes prominent, then Uttama Adhikari. So Shastriya Shraddha means that the faith is backed up by philosophy from an authorized Shastra. Okay, so it's not sentimental, it's based on the supreme authority. So just a few verses earlier in Chaitanya Charitamrita, it would have been Madhya 22, text 64, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, quote, "One becomes qualified as a devotee on the elementary platform, Kanishta, the intermediate platform, Madhyama, and the highest platform, Uttama, of devotional service, according to the development of his Shraddha, faith," end quote. So faith develops throughout, and the level of the development of faith will determine our level of understanding, our level of practice, and our spiritual advancement, right? It's how much of that faith has deepened, right? Or strengthened and deepened. So we've all learned that in our process, we go gradually from Shraddha to Prema, right? From initial faith to pure, unalloyed love of God. And there are 7 stages in between, so there's 9 altogether. But it's not that we attain one fully and then move on to the next stage. It's not that until we come completely past the first stage, we can't go to the second stage, like that. So each earlier stage continually grows with the cultivation of the next stage. So when we have a little faith in the process, which is Shraddha, we're willing to associate with the devotees, right? Sadhu Sangha, and learn from their experiences. Then, as we learn from the experiences of those sadhus, then our faith increases, right? And then so we listen to them more. As we listen to them more, then we're convinced that we should take up the process of devotional service, bhajana kriya. And so while doing this, our appreciation for the association of devotees and our faith both increase, right? And as they increase, we notice that there are unwanted things in our lives that are holding us back from further spiritual advancement. And so we endeavor to weed them out. That's called anartha nivritti, right? So as we weed out those anarthas, then our devotional practice, the bhajana kriya, is enhanced. Our appreciation for associating with the devotees, sadhu sangha, increases, and our faith, shraddha, deepens, right? And it continues just like that. As each step is cultivated, all the previous ones are also increasing, right? So our faith has to be both strong and deep in order to make proper progress, both unflinching and philosophically reinforced, so the Shastriya Shraddha. So the reason why we're talking about this today is that Arjuna exemplified and is expressing this kind of faith in these verses, not just today's verse, but all the verses before. He's talking about how it's Krishna alone who gave them everything they needed, who made all the arrangements that were happening, right? Arjuna understands that everything that he has accomplished as a great and powerful warrior was only a result of his connection with Sri Krishna. He understands that all powerful, opulent, beautiful, and glorious things spring from but a spark of Krishna's splendor, and that not a blade of grass moves without his will, right? So he understands this. And his faith, we should take note, it's not established because of his many externally successful endeavors. It's not that, okay, yeah, of course he has strong faith. Everything he does always works out, right? So we shouldn't think it's like that. We shouldn't think that faith comes from just, being successful, because some of Arjuna's endeavors, he actually quite regretted at the time, right? So, for example, the Battle of Kurukshetra, which, we're talking about in today's verse, he didn't want to fight these people. Bhishma Dev is highly respectable. Dronacharya was his teacher. He didn't want to fight with them, right? But he understood through his connection to Krishna that this is what Krishna wanted. He wanted to establish Yudhishthira as the emperor, and he wanted to get rid of all of these personalities. And in fact, the Lord told Arjuna that they're actually already dead. You just do your duty and then take the credit, right? So Arjuna understood this. His faith is strong and deep. Now, of course, we have to come to what this means for us, right? So we talked about faith. We talked about how that faith applies to Arjuna in all of these verses that he's speaking. It shows a very strong and deep level of faith. But what does it mean for us? So what it means for us is that we shouldn't be fair weather Vaishnavas. If someone's unfamiliar with that term, fair weather, there's this term, it's usually used for like sports, things like that. Like a fair weather golfer, for example, is someone, they only golf if the weather is absolutely perfect. If it's too hot or too cold, forget about it. If it's raining, definitely not, right? But the real players, they're out there, rain or shine, practicing, right? And they're always getting better. So we shouldn't be fair weather Vaishnavas. Only, our devotional service shouldn't depend on the external fruits of our service. The service to Krishna is our connection, not the material result. So we shouldn't only engage in devotional service when it has a positive result or what we consider to be a favorable material result, right? When we continue to serve Krishna with love, even when materially it's not seeming to work out, then we are showing Krishna that we are sincere. And that is the most important aspect of bhakti, that sincerity, especially against all odds, when it's hard, right? When it's difficult to make that decision and Krishna sees that we do it anyway, that's what he likes. It's the bhakti that he accepts. It's not the external, the object or the external activity or the external words that we're offering. It's the bhakti that's behind it all. So victory or defeat is not important. It's actually inconsequential. What matters is where our consciousness lies, where our faith lies. Is it in the material or is it in the spiritual? Are we seeing ourselves as the controller and enjoyer, or are we serving Krishna as the supreme controller and enjoyer? So if we continue this path with great determination and sincerity and cultivate knowledge of the Shastras as per our Guru's instructions, following the examples of the sadhus, then our faith will surely become both strong and deep. And we will thus be able to serve Krishna properly and achieve perfection. So that is what we are talking about today. Are there any questions on today's verse or on faith? I hope I wasn't speaking too quickly. There's an echo in this room, and I'm trying to beat the echo, so I think I'm talking too fast.
No, you were not too fast. It is
Okay, good.
definitely a lot of subject matter that needs to be that needs to sink in, I guess.
It's a lot to digest, yes.
Yes. The part about faith, you were saying that no matter what, we need to continue our service, whatever difficulty we have. I think the difficulty I have is it's not so much my personal service that I am doing. If there is a service I have to do, if I'm not feeling well, or if the result is not going my way and I chug along still, that is a different story. That is something that I can still try to do. But when I have to work with some other people, how do I know when to pull back, when to continue? Because then it is not just me and my faith, but it is also the other people that are involved. I don't want to give up, because you're saying I should continue to do my service. But then I also don't want to be in somebody else's way if they are right and I'm wrong. Or I don't want to get out because I'm right and they are wrong. Like what do you use then?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a very important one. And I think it's a issue that probably all of us have either dealt with or are currently dealing with. Pardon. So first things first is that we have to be engaged in service according to our natures, right? And it should also be under an authority who understands us. So if that's the case, then there will definitely be hard times. There will be times when we're doubting whether we're even qualified to do a particular service. But if we got that service from an authority, and it's actually according to our nature, then it's in our best interest to continue to do that service. Now, if it's causing us mental anxiety or things like that, we can speak with our authorities and figure out, basically what it comes down to is we have to understand how to engage in these services with the proper consciousness. It's not actually about the physical service, it's about the consciousness that we have while performing the service. And so if we find that it's difficult for us to keep a nice, proper consciousness of serving Krishna in a specific service, it means we may have to learn how to, in other words, it still might be the same exact service, but we have to figure out how to redirect our consciousness, how to focus that consciousness, right? And so that comes from faith, the actual faith. So there's Laukika Shraddha and Shastriya Shraddha. So the Shastriya means based on Shastra. And so this is why it's important for all of us to pay attention to what Shastra says. Because without it, we actually, without understanding what our proper sambandha is, our relationship with Krishna, we can't really make advancement. So again, if we are in a service that we're finding it difficult to focus on Krishna, then, like I said, we can speak to our authorities. But if we do have to replace it with a different service, we should make sure that we're going to give it our all there. In other words, we should never decrease our service. That's one of my spiritual master's main instructions, is never decrease your service. You may have to change it at some point, but it should never be decreased. So if you find that you have to give up one service, then you should accept it. Another one with at least the same amount of engagement, but it shouldn't be done whimsically. It should be done confiding in your authority, and it should be according to your nature, like that. Did that address your question, Mataji?
Yes, it did. Again, I think your answer makes it even more difficult, because now I have to think even harder. But like you said,
Welcome.
like your Guru Maharaj said, never decrease. Mother Sangeeta also, when we got our Jagannath deity, she said, be careful what service you start for him, because never go back. If you start
Yes.
something, make sure that you're building up on it, but not going backwards. So even in mundane matters, I have learned to do it that way. Be careful what I start, because if I cannot keep up, then it affects your confidence. So that's definitely one way to look at it. But yeah, keeping keeping an eye on your consciousness, and making sure that that is in the right places. It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard, but it's really the only thing that we have to do.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if we're not cultivating Shastric understanding, then we absolutely will be cultivating material understanding. There's no other option.
Mhm.
And so we as devotees know that we don't want to cultivate material faith. So we have to be sure that, when the mind is telling us, oh no, you can skip this, or you can do this instead, or, that's actually not even good for you. The mind will tell you that service isn't good for you, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to be more intelligent than the mind. And when intelligence has the proper ammunition of Shastra, right, then it can logically present it, and it has Shastric backing. Then the mind is easier to control, easier to make one's friend. But yes, service is a very important thing that we have to do. Sadhu Sangha also a very important thing. It's not something that we can take lightly, and it's something that we have to have a very complete understanding of. Because if we think that just by being in proximity of other aspiring Vaishnavas is Sadhu Sangha, then we don't have a proper understanding of what Sadhu Sangha truly is. Sadhu Sangha means that there has to be an exchange of the Sat principle. In other words, associate means to imbibe something from another, to take on that quality. And so the sadhus have a relationship with the Sat potency, the Sat Dharma, right? And so when they're preaching the Sat Dharma as they've heard from their guru, from the Shastras, and from other sadhus, we are to take that Sat knowledge, that eternal knowledge, and imbibe it, actually represent it, right? So that's what association means. So that's Sadhu Sangha. So if that exchange isn't happening, and that transformation isn't happening within us toward Krishna consciousness, then no matter how many devotees are in your proximity, it's not Sadhu Sangha. It may be Sadhu Sangha for them. It's not Sadhu Sangha for you if there's no transformation. So we have to understand what that is. And then if we surround ourselves with like-minded devotees who we gather inspiration from, then serving with those devotees is actually, it becomes natural, right? So first, so we talked about some of the process. We got to Anartha Nivritti earlier. And then firm faith, as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur mentions, is actually steadiness, right? So you have the initial faith, but it's not firm faith until you're steady. Then the faith still increases all the way up to prema, right? But it's at least firm when you're in nishta, right? Then, so nishta, you're still at least, you're still following Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, but you're doing it more than not doing it, right? Basically 50% or more of you wants to engage in the process. And then something in the mind is still trying to pull you back. Once you break that brink, then you get a taste, right? You actually get a taste for devotional service. So now it's not something that you should do. It's something that you want to do, right? Because when you taste something nice, you want that more. You want more of that, right? So then you're engaging in it because you want to, not because it's the right thing, know it's the proper thing to do. Then as that taste increases, then it becomes an attachment. It's not just relishing a taste of something, it's attachment to it. It means if someone tried to take it away from you, there would be a problem, attachment. And then from there, bhava, and then prema. So once that taste is there, it's actually a much more natural progression, right? So at first it can seem tedious, right? Because we know we have to do it. We know we should do it. And we know we want the result at the end, which is going to be sweet. But we don't, and we have little tidbits of taste of that process, but we don't have what's called a taste, meaning that we, just spontaneously, naturally go for that. So that's basically where we have to get to. And as we associate with like-minded devotees, we naturally progress through Vaidhi more rapidly, and then we can engage in then Raganuga sadhana bhakti under the Ragatmika devotees. Go Lokananda Priya Mataji, you have your hand up.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Very nice class.
Hare Krishna,
So,
thank you.
My question is about, about service you're attached to, then it's taken away from you. Then it's really very painful, like you said. It's very, very painful because something you're attached to. So in case it is taken and you don't have no choice.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you cope with it? Sometimes you feel like a kind of resentment for certain people who taking the service.
Definitely don't do that. No, you still engage in the service. In other words, if you're attached to that service, just because someone takes away an external version of that service doesn't mean you can't do that, even the exact service. You either do it somewhere else or in some other form, right? But the service has to be there. So if you were truly attached to that service and its connection to Krishna, if it gets taken away from you, you actually realize that it's not you see a person who you think took it away from you, but it was actually Krishna, right? Working through someone. So you shouldn't get mad at the person. So if you're truly attached to that service and your relationship to Krishna, you just realize that, okay, Krishna took this away from me here because he wants me to do it somewhere else or in some other respect, some other capacity, right? But the service you continue to do. No one can actually take away your service. They can take away some external activity, but that's not the service. The service is the bhakti, right?
Yeah, but it is human nature. Initially, you feel a little bit, hurt and say because of him,
Right.
Then after some time, you get over it.
So then it seems that the example you're giving may not be actually attachment in the state of nishta. It might be some sort of a mixed attachment, means partially material, partially spiritual. So in other words, one would appreciate the service, and it's a spiritual connection. But if one becomes envious or angry at someone who's taking it away, then it also means that there's also some sort of material inclination there as well. Whether it's a subtle form of profit, adoration, or distinction, or just the concept of I'm in control. I'm in control of this service. How could you possibly take it away from me? So Krishna is in control and we serve Krishna. And so it seems that what you're describing might be a mixed attachment. It's not like it doesn't seem like it's the level of nishta, although it's possible. But generally when we have these material feelings, in other words, even in spirituality, there is spiritual jealousy, for example, right? There are different camps of gopis who serve Krishna in different ways. And so there's some competition that's there. And so there's some transcendental jealousy, but it's not enmity, right? It's not envy. It's just, in other words, it increases both parties, their love increases for Krishna because of the transcendental competition. So if that's there, that's fine. One can have that sort of relationship with the devotees, sort of a reflection of that. But if it's more like material and enmity, envy, jealousy, like that, then that means that our service was most likely also tinged with material desires. Does that make sense, Mata? You're muted if you're talking.
Wait, but it's more complicated than that. You're really not envious of that person, but you feel hurt because that person has been plotting against you to take your service.
Oh, like that. So plotting again. Well, somehow we have to always have the faith, though, that Krishna's in control, and then we can do basically that same service somewhere else where no one's plotting against us. because there are circumstances when people legitimately are plotting against us, right? But if we're more attached to the service than the external aspect of the service, then we can certainly continue on with no problem, undaunted, as it were. But it is definitely complicated. I hope I'm not trying to make it sound oversimplistic. It is very complicated. But what it comes down to is that, and it's one of those easier said than done things. It's not the easiest thing to be completely forgiving of people who we perceive as taking something as valuable as Krishna's service away from us. But philosophically, we can see that, everything's being done for a reason. So maybe we weren't attentive enough in the service and it was being taken away, right? So in other words, it's the reason can't be, a material thing can't take away our service. So it couldn't have been that other devotee's enmity and wanting to take over your service. That couldn't be the reason, because material things can't take away bhakti, right? So it's because bhakti's in the heart. It's loving devotion to Krishna, and that can't be stifled by any material thing, right? The only thing that can cover it is, offenses, which quite bad. Or misusing our free will because we just don't want to. We don't want to engage in Christian service. We want to engage independently. So free will cover that, but nothing material can. So yeah, basically, if something like this happens, again, go to your authority, guru, follow the advice of the sadhus, study Shastra, understand how, how one is to react in such a situation, because we don't want to commit offenses. That's an important thing. So even if this other aspiring devotee who seemed to have been plotting against you and taking your service away, still somehow they're also aspiring devotee, so we can't commit offenses against them, otherwise we will lose our service, right? Because offenses, Krishna's devotees are all dear to him on all levels, right? And this is hard for us to imagine, but it's true. And we're actually quite thankful for that, because we're also on a very low level of devotional service. And if we weren't dear to Krishna, we wouldn't make any advancement. And so we're quite happy that Krishna loves his devotees so much that if someone offends one of them, he gets really upset about that. And so in the spiritual path, there's no diminution or loss. But if one commits an offense, one can lose access to that point in devotion until one rectifies that offense. So it could be that devotee was plotting against you and they committed an offense toward you. But then you should understand that I shouldn't counteract that offense with another offense, because then it becomes the whole eye for an eye makes the whole world blind situation, right? So we have to all learn tolerance, and sometimes these things happen just to teach us tolerance. That's Krishna's way of teaching us tolerance, and he's also showing us that if we are actually attached to the service, we will find another way to do it. Maybe it's somewhere else. Maybe it's just in a different capacity. It might be at home. Might even be manasa. There's all sorts of ways. There's unlimited ways to serve Krishna. So anyway, all of these things can be considered. But yes, it is quite difficult when that situation arises, and I can relate 100% with what you're saying. Is that sufficient, Mataji? I hope that helped.
It's sufficient. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there was another hand up, but I think they're not here anymore.
Yeah,
No,
Charajay Prabhu left.
Okay.
He must be having internet trouble. He's been in and out.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is there anything else?
There was a lot today, Prabhu.
Yeah, sorry. The thing is, there's
No,
another
that's
one.
fine.
Sorry. The thing with faith is that it's such a big topic, and you really have to tackle it from all those angles. It's one of those things that we think we understand it, but we don't. We have this small understanding of what faith is, and then we think, okay, that's good, we have faith.
Mhm.
But until we understand these different levels of faith and what it actually means, then, how are we going to be inspired to develop that faith if we don't even know that there's something more to it, right? Dronacharya Prabhu, go ahead.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, such a nice conversation. I'm glad that you've taken the time to address these questions. I think it's very helpful. It made me think, just to take it a little bit further, the idea of leaving a service or transitioning to another service. Sometimes I think the impression is oftentimes like once you start something, you have to do it until you die. Like that's yours until you die. You inherit it till you die. And if you leave it, you're basically leaving Krishna. And and sometimes things, it just seems like they're meant to be for a period of time. Not that you ever give up chanting the holy names. It's not that you give up reading the scriptures. It's not that you give up preaching or, serving Krishna, but specific things.
Yeah.
It's almost like we becoming attached, and please elaborate or redirect this. But it's who we're serving is that we should be attached to.
Yes.
Not necessarily what makes us comfortable.
Yes.
Serving that. And I've seen some temples where they've actually they rotate quite frequently. I think the Chowpatty temple in India, they rotate quite frequently, like even positions of management, positions of like Sankirtan leader. And they just kind of constantly move it through. So it doesn't become like, you're like kind of like the king and you're there until you die.
Right.
So it's like constantly ever fresh, kind of moving through every, whatever period of time it may be. But this sometimes the idea, I just wanted to get your opinion on of transitioning service and moving from one service to another, or, when is it the right time to leave a service and things like that. That can be done in a healthy way.
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Yeah. It's actually natural that, because the process of Krishna consciousness means that whatever we currently have an attraction for, right, that's not connected to Krishna, materially speaking. The process of Krishna consciousness means that we take that specific thing, our conditioned nature, and we engage it in Krishna's service, right? And when we do that, it purifies that desire, right? When it's successfully purified, we no longer have an attachment for it. So there's no longer any need to purify it any further. It's already purified. And so then we deal with the next, because we don't just have one material conditioning, we have several, right? Several layers. And so we move on to the next one, right? And so that might mean that we continue that service that we did before, but it's just completely connected to Krishna, but it's still favorable, so we continue to do it. Or it might mean, well, I've purified that desire, and although this is still a favorable activity in my Krishna consciousness, there is also a more favorable activity that is more in line with my current conditioning, which has been already partially purified, right? And so it is natural to change the service. Again, it doesn't ever decrease, right? In other words, you have to replace it with something it's not even equal value, it's higher value, right? And so it's based on our new conditioned nature, right? Because we have to engage that in Krishna's service. So I've done this before. I think everyone on here knows that I used to be a race car driver and that I used that in Krishna's service. And then at one point, it came to the end of its usefulness. for me. And then, so then I moved on to Shastric study. And so I've been doing that for the past 17 years. And so there's also been other things that, you know, that I was engaging my particular nature in Krishna service. But then once it was engaged, then it was no longer as favorable as something else, right? So yeah, these services can change. What we were, yeah, we definitely never decrease them. And also, as far as what we were talking about earlier, if you set a standard, like for deity worship, for example, you should never go back on that. So those services, you do, or at least you get them covered, right? You know, you pass them on to what's it called? When you have your I lose words all the time. Someone that comes after you, preceptor? No, that's before. Anyway, you pass it down to somebody that's qualified that can actually, you know, take care
Successor.
of it. Successor, thank you. Hare Krishna. That happens to me all the time, Prabhu.
Okay.
I forget words. Yeah, so you pass it down to a successor like that. But yeah, in general, our service should be based on, because we have our constitutional nature, right, which is to serve Krishna, and we have our conditioned nature, right? We have to address our conditioned nature and engage it in Krishna service. That's how we become purified. So therefore, the services, the external manifestation of those services will change, but the principle will always remain the same, utilizing whatever you see is valuable properly in Krishna service, if that makes sense. We can talk about this for hours, but
Sure,
think-
sure. Thank you.
I think-
I think you've really touched on something very nice. That's helped me focus. I think a lot of devotees on here focus as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, these topics are so important to fully understand, and they have so many different subtle nuances. I mean, just on principle, it's easy to understand, but we're not at the point where we can understand just on principle, right? Because what it comes down to is always remember Krishna, never forget him. But none of us know what that means. So we have to have details. We have to have regulative principles. We have to have, you know, fixed services like that. And then as we become purified, then we can start appreciating just the principle, and then we can apply Krishna consciousness anywhere within our life. So these conversations are really important because, you know, they discuss the details, but in a way that's addressing the principle so that we can see the details for actually what it is. So it's not just that what we are supposed to do, but how we are supposed to do it, right? Because it's less about what we're doing and more about how we're doing it, as we talked about today with the Laukika and Shastriya Shraddhas. Thank you for that question, sir.
Thank you, Prabhu, for the answer.
Seems we've gone quite over now.
For good reason, I think.
Sure.
Thanks again, Prabhu. Thank you for coming to us all the way from Mayapur.
Yes, and I'm actually on time this time. You don't. No one can fathom how bad I felt about that. It's just no one could.
And I hope we did not contribute to that at all. It's just that
no. It's all
for your association. So we really appreciate you joining us still on your schedule. So thank you, and so we'll meet again tomorrow morning at 7:50.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Prabhu, for a nice class.
Sure.
Lot of information.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srimad
Jai.
Bhagavatam.
Jai.
Jai. Sarabhi Shakti Sindhubhyecha Astanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namah. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Chandra Prabhu, have you happened to run into Prihat Mridanga Prabhu at all?
I did, yes, on his first day here. I believe it was last Sunday, was it Sunday? Bhagavatam class. I
Good.
saw.
Good. I was
haven't
hoping
seen
you
him since, but yeah.
would see each other.
Yeah, he's much taller than I expected.
I think he's like 6'3".
Yeah.
He stands out definitely in the crowd. He stands out.
Absolutely. But yeah, he's here.
That's good. Good. I'm glad you guys connected. Yeah. All right, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Hare.